At 0530 hours on December 22nd, 1944, Oberst Heinz Kokot crouched in a frozen foxhole 300 meters from the American perimeter at Bastogne, Belgium, watching his men prepare for an assault that should have ended 3 days ago. Kokot commanded the 26th Volksgrenadier Division. 44 years old, veteran of the Eastern Front, experienced in siege warfare. His division had surrounded the American position on December 20th, 1944. The Americans were trapped. No supplies, no reinforcements, no escape routes. Kokot had approximately 8,000 men, tanks, artillery, and orders to take Bastogne immediately. The road junction was critical to the entire German offensive in the Ardennes. The defenders were paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division, approximately 18,000 men, mostly lightly armed infantry with minimal heavy weapons. They had arrived in trucks on December 19th, rushed forward without proper winter equipment or adequate ammunition. Most wore summer uniforms in temperatures below freezing. The 101st itself had no tanks. Their organic artillery was limited. Standard military doctrine said surrounded light infantry against armored divisions lasted maybe 48 hours before surrendering. The conditions inside the perimeter were harsh from the beginning. Food supplies were limited. The division had not brought enough rations for an extended siege. By December 21st, men were on half rations. Some units were eating 1 meal per day. Soldiers scrounged food from abandoned Belgian houses and farms. They slaughtered livestock when they found it. Hunger was constant. Medical supplies were critically short. The division clearing station had been captured on December 19th, along with most medical personnel and supplies. Wounded men were treated in makeshift aid stations with whatever materials could be found. Surgeons operated without proper anesthesia. Bandages were washed and reused. Men died from wounds that would have been survivable with proper medical care. Ammunition was rationed strictly. Machine gunners were told to fire only at confirmed targets. Riflemen were ordered to make every shot count. Artillery batteries calculated exactly how many shells they could fire per day and still have ammunition for emergencies. By December 22nd, artillery units were restricted to 10 rounds per gun per day. This was barely enough to support defensive operations. Artillery commanders had to choose targets carefully. They could not afford suppressive fire or harassing missions. Every shell had to count. Among the artillery units defending Bastogne was the 969th Field Artillery Battalion, an all-black unit equipped with 155 mm howitzers. The 969th had been attached to the 101st Airborne specifically to provide heavy fire support that the Airborne Division lacked organically. The battalion performed with distinction throughout the siege, firing thousands of rounds in support of the defenders, despite severe ammunition shortages. The defenders knew they could not resupply by ground. They had to make what they had last until relief arrived or until they were overrun. The cold was as dangerous as the Germans. Temperatures dropped below freezing every night. Soldiers in foxholes suffered from frostbite and trench foot. Some lost toes or fingers to cold injuries. Men huddled together for warmth. They stuffed newspapers and rags into their uniforms for insulation. They wrapped their feet in burlap sacks. The cold sapped energy and made everything harder. Despite these hardships, morale remained high. The paratroopers believed they would be relieved. They believed Patton was coming. They believed the siege would end before they ran out of ammunition or food. That belief sustained them through conditions that would have broken less confident units. It was now day 3. The Americans were still fighting. Kokot had seen surrounded units before. On the Eastern Front, encircled Soviet formations either broke out immediately or collapsed within 2 days once they realized escape was impossible. Trapped units lost cohesion fast. Officers lost control. Men deserted positions, seeking food or warmth. The will to fight evaporated once soldiers understood they were going to die or be captured. But these American paratroopers were different. Kokot could not understand why. His division had launched multiple major assaults in 3 days. Each time his men advanced expecting the American line to crack. Each time they hit resistance that should not have existed. Machine gun positions that should have been suppressed kept firing. Foxholes that should have been abandoned were still occupied. American soldiers who should have been demoralized fought like they expected to win. The casualty reports made no sense. Kokot's battalions were taking losses at rates typical for attacking fortified positions, not for overwhelming a surrounded enemy. His regimental commanders reported that American fire discipline was excellent, ammunition management was controlled, and defensive positions were professionally maintained. These were not the characteristics of a trapped, desperate force awaiting annihilation. Something about these paratroopers was fundamentally different from any enemy Kokot had faced in 5 years of war. The problem was not the terrain. Bastogne sat in rolling farmland with clear fields of fire. The town itself was small, defensible, but not naturally strong. The Americans held maybe 16 square kilometers of perimeter, a thin line around the road junction. Kokot's artillery could reach every position. His forces could attack from all directions simultaneously. The problem was not American equipment. Kokot's intelligence officers had examined abandoned American positions and captured supplies. The paratroopers had M1 Garand rifles, some Browning machine guns, a few bazookas, and limited mortar support. Nothing unusual. Their equipment was standard American infantry gear, adequate but not exceptional. True, the Americans had some attached armor and artillery units, but these were not enough to explain their defensive success. The problem was not American numbers. Kokot's staff estimated defender strength at 18,000 maximum. His division alone fielded 8,000 men, and multiple additional divisions were attacking other sectors of the perimeter. When counting all German forces involved in the siege, the Germans had nearly 5-to-1 numerical superiority and complete advantage in armor and artillery. Yet the attacks kept failing. The first major assault came on December 20th at 1400 hours. Kokot sent 2 battalions against the eastern perimeter near the village of Bastogne. The plan was textbook. Artillery preparation, followed by infantry advance supported by assault guns. The American positions would be suppressed, his men would close distance, and the line would break. The artillery barrage landed exactly as planned. Kokot watched through binoculars from his command post. Shells bracketed the American foxholes. Trees splintered. Earth fountains erupted. The bombardment lasted 15 minutes, more than enough to neutralize light infantry positions. His battalions advanced. They crossed 300 meters of open ground. They reached 200 meters from the American line. Then the Americans opened fire. The volume of fire made no sense. The artillery should have suppressed those positions, but machine guns fired from multiple points along the line. Rifle fire was controlled and accurate. American mortars dropped rounds precisely on his advancing infantry. His men went to ground. The attack stalled. Casualties mounted. Kokot ordered a second wave forward. The fresh battalion pushed through the first wave and continued the advance. They reached 100 meters from the American foxholes. The fire intensified. His men could not cross the final distance. Officers fell. Squad leaders went down. The advance stopped completely. By 1600 hours, Kokot pulled his forces back. The attack had failed. His battalions reported 180 casualties. The Americans still held their positions. His officers reported that American defensive fire never slackened, even under artillery bombardment. The paratroopers had stayed in their foxholes during the barrage and immediately resumed firing when the German infantry appeared. That behavior was unusual. Kokot had seen many units break under artillery fire. Soldiers abandoned positions to seek cover. Even disciplined troops needed time to recover from bombardment before resuming effective defense. But the Americans at Bastogne seemed immune to artillery. They took the shelling and fought back as if nothing had happened. By December 21st evening, Kokot received orders from Corps headquarters to demand American surrender. The Corps commander believed the threat of annihilation would persuade the Americans to give up. Surrounded units always surrendered once they understood their situation was hopeless. The 101st Airborne was trapped without hope of relief or resupply. Surely they would see reason. On the morning of December 22nd, German officers delivered the surrender ultimatum to the American lines under flag of truce. The ultimatum was detailed and formal. It pointed out that the Americans were completely surrounded, that resistance was futile, that continued fighting would result in total annihilation, and that honorable surrender terms were offered. The American reply came back within an hour. It consisted of one word: nuts. Kokot read the reply in his command post. He did not understand the American slang, but his English-speaking intelligence officer explained the meaning. The American commander was refusing to surrender in the most contemptuous way possible. This was unprecedented. Kokot had delivered or received surrender ultimatums multiple times during the war. Surrounded commanders might refuse surrender if they believed relief was imminent or if they thought they could break out. But they responded with military formality. They cited reasons. They negotiated terms. The one-word reply indicated something different. The Americans were not just refusing to surrender. They were mocking the German demand. The paratroopers were surrounded, outnumbered, outgunned, freezing, and running low on ammunition. And they were laughing at the suggestion they might give up. Kokot began to understand what he was fighting. The 101st Airborne Division was an elite formation, but not because of equipment or numbers. They were elite because of something else, something psychological. These soldiers genuinely believed they would win, not hoped they would win, not fought because they had no choice. They believed victory was certain despite being surrounded by forces that outnumbered them 5-to-1. That belief changed everything. Soldiers who believe they will die fight desperately, but usually break once casualties mount. Soldiers who believe capture is inevitable preserve their lives and eventually surrender. But soldiers who believe they will win fight with calculated aggression. They take risks. They counterattack. They hold positions that seem impossible to hold because they do not see those positions as impossible. The paratroopers at Bastogne believed the German army surrounding them was already defeated. They just had to hold their positions until relief arrived or until the Germans gave up and left. That belief made them extraordinarily dangerous. Every German unit attacking Bastogne reported the same observations. The Americans never abandoned positions without orders. Wounded, paratroopers continued fighting from their foxholes. Officers stayed with their men instead of directing from safety. Every defensive position had to be taken by direct assault because the Americans would not yield ground just because they were outflanked or under heavy fire. The psychological effect on German troops was significant. Soldiers advancing against the American perimeter knew they were attacking an enemy that would not quit. That knowledge made men hesitate. It made them seek cover more quickly. It made them less willing to press attacks when resistance appeared. Kokot's regimental commanders began warning their battalions that attacking the Americans at Bastogne was different from other operations. The paratroopers were professional soldiers who would die in their positions rather than retreat. That reputation spread through the German divisions. Units preparing to attack the perimeter were told they faced elite American troops who had never been defeated. Stories circulated about American defensive tactics, about paratroopers holding foxholes alone after their entire squad was killed, still firing until they ran out of ammunition. About wounded Americans refusing medical evacuation to stay with their units. About positions that were overrun at night being retaken by American counterattacks at dawn. Some of these stories were exaggerated, but enough were true that German soldiers began to fear the 101st Airborne in a way they feared few other Allied units. German intelligence tried to understand what made these Americans different. They examined captured American equipment and found nothing exceptional. They interrogated prisoners and learned the paratroopers were mostly young soldiers, many in their first major battle. The Germans could not identify any tactical advantage or superior weaponry. The advantage was psychological. The Americans believed they would hold Bastogne. That belief was not based on wishful thinking. It was based on confidence in their training, trust in their officers, and faith in their comrades. Every man in every foxhole knew the soldiers beside him would not break. That certainty created a defensive line that could not be cracked through conventional assault. On December 23rd, the weather cleared. For the first time in 4 days, the fog lifted and the sky became visible. That change ended any hope Kokot had of taking Bastogne. The fog had been both blessing and curse for the defenders. It concealed German movements and prevented American aircraft from operating. But it also prevented German observation and limited the effectiveness of German artillery. The Americans adapted to fighting in fog better than the Germans expected. When the weather cleared on the 23rd, the transformation was immediate. The sky turned from gray, overcast, to brilliant blue. Visibility extended for kilometers. American forward observers could finally see German positions clearly. Artillery fire became more accurate, but more importantly, aircraft could operate. The clear weather allowed American aircraft to operate. At 1000 hours, transport planes appeared over Bastogne and began dropping supplies by parachute. 241 C-47 transport aircraft delivered over 140 tons of supplies in 1,446 bundles. The supplies included ammunition, medical supplies, and food. The drops were remarkably accurate, despite German anti-aircraft fire. Approximately 95% of the bundles were recovered by American forces inside the perimeter. More importantly, American fighter bombers appeared and began attacking German positions. The air attacks hit artillery positions, armor concentrations, and supply columns. The Germans had no air cover. The Luftwaffe was virtually absent from the Ardennes. American planes dominated the sky completely. Kokot's supply situation became critical immediately. His ammunition stocks were low after 3 days of continuous combat. His fuel reserves were nearly exhausted. His casualty clearing stations were overwhelmed with wounded, and now American aircraft were destroying trucks trying to bring forward supplies. Every vehicle that moved during daylight was targeted. Supply convoys had to move at night, which slowed everything. The Americans inside Bastogne, meanwhile, were receiving hundreds of tons of supplies from the air. Their ammunition was replenished. Their wounded could be treated properly. Their defensive positions could be maintained. The siege was being broken not by relief forces on the ground, but by air power that the Germans could not counter. The 101st Airborne was no longer trapped. They were being sustained indefinitely from the air, while German forces around them slowly starved of supplies and reinforcements. On December 24th, Kokot received intelligence that American armored forces were advancing from the south. General Patton's Third Army was driving toward Bastogne to relieve the siege. The lead elements were less than 10 kilometers away and fighting through German defensive positions. Kokot understood what that meant. If American armor broke through to Bastogne, his division would be trapped between the paratroopers inside the perimeter and the tanks approaching from outside. His forces would be destroyed. The hunters would become the hunted. He requested permission to withdraw, while withdrawal was still possible. Corps headquarters refused. Hitler had personally ordered that Bastogne be taken. The Führer's directive was absolute. The attack would continue regardless of cost. On December 25th, Christmas Day, German commanders launched a major coordinated assault. This would be the largest and most desperate attack of the siege. At 0300 hours, 18 Panzer IV tanks carrying infantry from the 115th Panzer Grenadier Regiment of the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division attacked from between the villages of Flamierge and Givry. The objective was the northwestern perimeter near the villages of Champs and Hemroul. The attack came from a direction the Germans hoped would be less heavily defended. The assault began in darkness. The tanks advanced in a tight formation with infantry riding on the hulls and following close behind. The temperature was well below freezing. The ground was frozen solid, hard as concrete. Visibility was limited to perhaps 50 meters in the pre-dawn darkness. The Germans hoped to achieve tactical surprise and penetrate the American line before defenders could react. The Americans were waiting. They had identified the likely German attack route during daylight reconnaissance on December 24th. Artillery from the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment and attached units had registered their guns on the approach paths. Defensive positions were reinforced with additional bazooka teams and anti-tank guns. The Americans knew an attack was coming. They just did not know exactly when. As the German columns approached through the darkness, American forward observers detected the sound of tank engines. Artillery fire was called in immediately. Within minutes, shells began falling on the German advance. The shells had proximity fuses that detonated above ground, spraying shrapnel downward across a wide area. The effect on infantry in open terrain was devastating. German soldiers riding on the tanks were hit immediately. Many fell to the ground, wounded or dead. The infantry following behind sought cover but found none in the open fields. Men went down in groups. The column wavered but kept moving. The tanks could not stop. Stopping meant being destroyed in place. The tanks pushed forward despite the artillery fire, trying to reach the American line before more damage could be inflicted. Tank commanders buttoned up their hatches and drove blind through the explosions. At 300 meters from the defensive positions, American anti-tank guns opened direct fire. Tank destroyers positioned in hull down positions and towed guns opened up simultaneously. The muzzle flashes lit up the darkness like lightning. The 1st Panzer IV exploded in a ball of flame. The ammunition inside cooked off, sending secondary explosions through the hull. Another took a direct hit to the turret and stopped, smoke pouring from the hatches. A third had its tracks blown off and slewed sideways, blocking the path of tanks behind it. The surviving tanks accelerated, spreading out to make more difficult targets. German tank commanders fired their weapons blindly toward the American muzzle flashes, hoping to suppress the anti-tank guns. The infantry that had been following could no longer keep up. Many were pinned down by artillery fire. Some were already dead or wounded. The tanks continued alone into the American defenses. Several Panzer IVs penetrated the forward American line. They drove past the initial foxholes and reached the battalion command post area at Hemroul. For a brief moment, it appeared the German attack might succeed. American positions were overrun. German infantry who had survived the artillery barrage entered the village behind the tanks. Close quarters fighting erupted in the darkness. German soldiers and American paratroopers fought in streets and houses. The situation was confused and desperate. Then American paratroopers counterattacked. Officers organized small teams with bazookas and moved forward through the confusion. Sergeants rallied their men and pushed back against the German penetration. The Americans engaged the tanks at close range, sometimes from less than 20 meters away. They targeted tracks and engine compartments, the vulnerable points where armor was thinnest. Bazooka teams worked in pairs, one firing while the other reloaded. American infantry cleared German soldiers from captured positions using grenades, rifle fire, and hand-to-hand combat. The fighting was vicious and personal. Men killed each other at ranges measured in meters. No quarter was asked or given. The Americans fought with the confidence that they would win. The Germans fought with the desperation of men who knew they were losing. The battle lasted through the early morning hours. Tank after tank was destroyed or disabled. Some crews abandoned their vehicles and tried to escape on foot through the darkness. American machine gun fire cut them down before they could reach German lines. German infantry attempting to consolidate gains found themselves isolated and surrounded. They either surrendered or were killed fighting in small groups. By 0700 hours, as dawn began to break, the fighting had ended. All 18 German tanks lay destroyed or disabled in the fields and streets around Hemrola and Champs. Burning hulks marked the German advance like a trail of funeral pyres. The infantry attack had collapsed completely. German forces withdrew, leaving hundreds of casualties behind. The Americans had held their positions and actually advanced their line in several places during the counterattack. The Christmas Day assault was the last major German attempt to take Bastogne by direct assault. Every attack over 6 days had failed. Every advance had been repulsed with heavy losses. The Germans had committed thousands of men and dozens of tanks. They had achieved nothing except casualties they could not afford and delays they could not sustain. On December 26, at approximately 1645 hours, lead elements of the 4th Armored Division from Patton's 3rd Army reached the southern edge of the Bastogne perimeter. The first tank to break through was an M4A3E2 Sherman Jumbo nicknamed Cobra King, commanded by First Lieutenant Charles Boggess. The crew had fought through multiple German defensive positions to reach Bastogne. The relief operation had cost the 4th Armored Division approximately 1,000 casualties in 5 days of continuous fighting. The breakthrough came through the village of Assinois, south of Bastogne. The route was heavily defended by German forces trying to prevent exactly this link-up. American armor and infantry fought house to house through Assinois. Tank destroyers knocked out German anti-tank guns. Infantry cleared German positions with grenades and rifle fire. The advance was slow and costly, but unstoppable. When Boggess's tank reached the American perimeter, paratroopers from the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion met them. The engineers had been fighting as infantry throughout the siege. They waved and cheered as the Sherman rolled up. Boggess asked where the headquarters was. The engineers directed him into town. The relief did not end the battle. German forces continued attacking the corridor Patton had opened. They tried to cut off the relief column and re-establish the siege. Fighting continued for days as more American forces pushed into Bastogne and widened the corridor. But the critical moment was when that first tank arrived. The paratroopers were no longer surrounded. They were no longer alone. The siege was broken. Cocotte withdrew his forces that night. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division had suffered heavy casualties during the siege. The exact numbers would never be fully documented, as German record-keeping had collapsed by this point in the war. But the division had been stopped by a force it outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded. The 101st Airborne had held. What Cocotte and other German commanders did not understand until after the war was why the Americans fought so differently. It was not just training or equipment or leadership, though all those factors mattered. It was something more fundamental. The 101st Airborne Division was an all-volunteer force. Every soldier had volunteered for paratrooper training, one of the most difficult programs in the American military. The training itself was designed to eliminate anyone who would quit under pressure. Men who wanted easy assignments did not volunteer for the airborne. Men who feared heights did not volunteer. Men who doubted their physical abilities did not volunteer. The program began with basic infantry training, then moved to jump school at Fort Benning, Georgia. The physical standards were brutal. Candidates ran miles carrying full equipment. They did hundreds of push-ups and pull-ups. They climbed ropes and obstacle courses. The training was deliberately harder than necessary because the instructors wanted to break anyone who could be broken. Better to fail in Georgia than to fail in combat where failure meant death. Many candidates quit. The dropout rate exceeded 30%. Some men realized they were not suited for airborne operations. Others were injured during training. A few were dismissed for disciplinary reasons. But the men who completed, the program emerged with absolute confidence in themselves and their comrades. They had been tested and proven. They wore the silver wings on their chest with pride. More importantly, the training created bonds between soldiers that regular infantry units could not match. Paratroopers jumped out of aircraft together. They trusted their equipment, their riggers, and each other with their lives. That trust extended to combat. When a paratrooper went into battle, he knew every man beside him had volunteered for this, had completed the same training, and had proven himself under the same standards. The 101st Airborne specifically had been activated in August 1942. The division trained together for over a year before seeing combat. Battalions trained together, companies trained together, squads trained together. By the time they deployed to England in 1943, they were one of the most cohesive divisions in the American Army. They first saw combat during the Normandy invasion on D-Day, June 6, 1944. Paratroopers jumped behind German lines in darkness and fought scattered actions for days. Many units were separated from their parent formations. Small groups fought independently, improvising and adapting. The division learned that officers could be killed and units would continue fighting. Sergeants and even private soldiers took command when necessary. After Normandy, the division fought through France. They returned to England to refit and train. Then came Operation Market Garden in September 1944, the airborne assault into Holland. The 101st jumped into Eindhoven and fought for 8 days, holding a narrow corridor while British forces tried to push through to Arnhem. The operation failed strategically, but the 101st accomplished every objective assigned to it. By December 1944, the division was resting in Camp Mourmelon when the German offensive began in the Ardennes. The paratroopers were rushed forward without proper winter equipment because there was no time. They arrived at Bastogne wearing what they had, carrying what ammunition they could grab, and trusting that logistics would catch up eventually. That combat experience shaped how they fought at Bastogne. These were not green troops seeing their first action. They were veterans who had jumped into France, fought in hedgerows, held Dutch towns, and survived 2 major airborne operations. They knew what combat felt like. They knew how to function under fire. They knew officers would die and units would keep fighting. When the Germans surrounded Bastogne, the paratroopers were not afraid because they had been in bad situations before and survived. They trusted their training, their leaders, and most importantly, each other. They were not conscripts. They were not draftees assigned to units they did not choose. They were men who specifically requested the hardest, most dangerous job in the army. And they trained together as a cohesive unit for months before being committed to combat. That selection process created units with unusual psychological cohesion. The paratroopers knew every man in their squad had chosen to be there. They knew their comrades would not quit because quitting was not why anyone joined the Airborne. They trusted each other completely because the training had proven everyone's commitment. When the 101st was surrounded at Bastogne, none of the men considered surrender a possibility, not because they were ordered to fight to the death, but because surrender conflicted with their self-image. They were elite troops. Elite troops did not surrender just because they were outnumbered. The thought was almost absurd. That mindset created the defensive performance that shocked German forces. The paratroopers were not fighting desperately to survive. They were fighting confidently to win. They believed relief was coming, believed they could hold until it arrived, and believed the Germans surrounding them were more desperate than they were. They were correct. German units that fought at Bastogne carried the memory of that battle for the rest of the war. Officers who had been there warned new troops about American paratroopers. Soldiers who had attacked the perimeter told stories about the ferocity of the defense. The 101st Airborne gained a reputation among German forces that exceeded their actual strength. The stories were specific and disturbing to German soldiers. They heard about American machine gun positions that kept firing even after being hit by direct artillery strikes, about paratroopers who stayed in foxholes that had been overrun, waiting for German infantry to pass, then shooting them from behind, about wounded Americans who refused to be taken prisoner and fought until they were killed. German soldiers heard about the American medics who crossed open ground under fire to reach wounded men, about officers who led counterattacks personally rather than sending men forward from safety, about sergeants who held positions alone after their entire squad was dead or wounded. These stories painted a picture of an enemy that simply would not quit under any circumstances. The psychological impact was profound. German infantry who had fought successfully against Soviet forces or British units found themselves hesitating before attacking American paratroopers. They called for more artillery preparation. They waited for tank support. They advanced more slowly and took fewer risks. That hesitation cost them tactical momentum and gave American forces time to respond. German commanders noticed the change in their soldiers' behavior. Units that normally pressed attacks aggressively became cautious when facing the 101st Airborne. Officers had to push their men harder to maintain offensive pressure. The fear of facing American paratroopers became a tangible factor in German tactical planning. In January 1945, when German units encountered American paratroopers in other battles, they approached more cautiously. They called for more artillery support before attacking. They assumed the Americans would fight harder and hold longer than regular infantry. That hesitation gave American forces tactical advantages in subsequent engagements. That reputation affected German tactical decisions throughout the final months of the war in Europe. Units avoided engaging American airborne forces when possible. Commanders allocated extra resources when combat was unavoidable. The psychological impact of Bastogne spread far beyond that single battle. Oberst Heinz Kokot survived the war. He surrendered to American forces in April 1945. During his interrogation, intelligence officers asked about Bastogne. Kokot told them the battle was the most difficult of his career. He said the 101st Airborne fought better than any unit he had faced on either the Eastern or Western Front. He was asked what made them different. Kokot thought for a long moment before answering. He said the Americans at Bastogne fought like they had already won and were just waiting for the Germans to realize it. That confidence, he said, was more dangerous than any weapon. In post-war interrogations with United States Army historians, Kokot described the battle as the moment he understood Germany would lose the war. Not because of American numbers or equipment, but because of American will. If the United States could produce thousands of soldiers like the paratroopers at Bastogne, soldiers who volunteered for the hardest jobs and then performed impossibly well under the worst conditions, Germany could not win, no matter how many tanks or divisions it fielded. Quality mattered more than quantity when quality reached a certain level. The 101st Airborne at Bastogne represented a quality of soldier that could not be overcome through numbers or tactics. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe commanded the 101st Airborne at Bastogne. He was the officer who replied nuts to the German surrender demand. McAuliffe survived the war and continued serving in the Army. He retired as a full general in 1956. He was asked many times about Bastogne. He always credited his soldiers rather than his leadership. He said commanding the 101st Airborne was easy because they were professionals who knew their jobs and did not need detailed orders. The nuts reply became legendary. The full story of that reply reveals much about McAuliffe and his command style. When German officers delivered the surrender ultimatum on the morning of December 22nd, McAuliffe was sleeping in his command post after working through the night coordinating defenses. His staff woke him to read the ultimatum. According to Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, the division operations officer who was present, McAuliffe read the German demand and said, "Aw, nuts." He dropped the paper on the floor and started to leave. His staff asked what reply they should send. McAuliffe said he did not know. Kinnard suggested they send back exactly what McAuliffe had said. The staff agreed it was perfect. McAuliffe sat down and typed the reply himself on his personal typewriter. The message was simple and direct. It read, "To the German commander, Nuts, the American commander." He did not sign his name. He did not explain what nuts meant. He did not elaborate or negotiate. One word was sufficient. Colonel Joseph Harper delivered the reply to the German officers who had brought the ultimatum. They were waiting under white flags at the American perimeter. The Germans were blindfolded and escorted to the meeting point according to military protocol. Harper handed them the typed message. The German officers read it and looked confused. They did not understand American slang. Lieutenant Helmuth Henke, one of the German officers, asked Harper what nuts meant in English. Harper thought for a moment, then told them it meant the same as "go to hell." The Germans understood that clearly enough. The German officers returned to their lines with the reply. When they reported to their commanders, the response created confusion and then anger. German officers were not accustomed to such informal, contemptuous rejections of formal surrender demands. The reply was seen as an insult to military professionalism. It indicated that the Americans were not taking the German threat seriously. But the truth was exactly the opposite. The Americans took the German threat very seriously. They simply had no intention of surrendering regardless of the threat. The Nuts reply was not bravado or bluster. It was a simple statement of fact. The 101st Airborne would not surrender. Asking them to do so was absurd. Therefore, nuts. The reply spread quickly through both armies. German soldiers heard about it and realized they were fighting an enemy that could not be intimidated. American soldiers heard about it and gained confidence from their commander's defiance. Within hours, every paratrooper in Bastogne knew what McAuliffe had told the Germans. It became a rallying cry. Nuts. We will not surrender. We will not break. Nuts to anyone who thinks otherwise. McAuliffe himself was surprised at how much attention it received. He said it was the obvious response to an absurd demand. The Germans thought the Americans would surrender just because they were surrounded. Any paratrooper would have laughed at that assumption. The veterans of Bastogne carried the memory of that siege for the rest of their lives. They knew what they had accomplished. They had been outnumbered 5-1, surrounded, undersupplied, and freezing. And they had won, not survived. Won. The German attack had failed completely. The Americans held their positions and inflicted losses the Germans could not afford. That knowledge gave them confidence in every subsequent battle. If they could hold Bastogne, they could do anything. The 101st Airborne fought through the rest of the war. They participated in Operation Market Garden in Holland. They fought in the Rhineland campaign. They were among the first Allied units to reach Hitler's mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden. They earned a reputation as one of the finest divisions in the American Army. But Bastogne remained their defining moment. That battle demonstrated what elite light infantry could accomplish through sheer determination and professional skill. The Germans had every advantage except the will to win at any cost. The 101st Airborne had that will. It made all the difference. For its defense of Bastogne, the headquarters of the 101st Airborne Division was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation. This is one of the highest unit awards in the American military. The citation streamer embroidered with the word Bastogne became part of the division's colors. The division was also awarded the Belgian Croix de Guerre with palm for its actions. These honors recognized not just military success, but the extraordinary spirit the paratroopers displayed under impossible conditions. Individual soldiers were also recognized. Several medals of honor were awarded for actions during the siege and relief operations. Countless Bronze Stars and Silver Stars were awarded to soldiers who performed acts of courage that might have been impossible to document fully given the chaos of battle. But for most of the defenders, the greatest reward was survival and the knowledge of what they had accomplished. They had held when everyone expected them to break. They had won when everyone expected them to lose. The siege of Bastogne lasted 6 days. In that time, the 101st Airborne and attached units suffered approximately 3,000 casualties. German forces surrounding the town lost thousands of men. The Americans killed or disabled dozens of German tanks. They disrupted the entire German offensive in the Ardennes by holding a critical road junction. The strategic impact was enormous. The delay at Bastogne gave Allied forces time to reposition and counterattack. The German offensive, which had initially achieved surprise and made significant gains, ground to a halt. By early January 1945, German forces were retreating and never regained the initiative. The Battle of the Bulge, as it became known, was Germany's last major offensive in the West. The importance of Bastogne cannot be overstated. The town controlled 7 major roads that the Germans needed for their advance. Without those roads, German armor and supply vehicles could not move efficiently. The entire offensive depended on capturing Bastogne quickly and using those roads to push west toward the Meuse River and eventually Antwerp. When the 101st Airborne held Bastogne, they forced the Germans to go around the town. That created massive traffic congestion on secondary roads. German armored divisions that should have been advancing west were stuck in traffic jams on narrow roads. Fuel trucks could not reach forward units. Ammunition supplies were delayed. The offensive lost momentum not because of battlefield defeats, but because of logistics failures caused by one surrounded American division. Hitler's insistence on capturing Bastogne diverted German resources from the main offensive. Divisions that should have been pushing toward the Meuse were instead attacking American paratroopers in a siege they could not win. Every day the siege continued was another day for Allied forces to bring up reinforcements, position artillery, and prepare counterattacks. General Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, understood this immediately. When he learned the 101st was surrounded at Bastogne, he ordered them to hold at all costs. He knew that every day they held was a day the German offensive could not succeed. The paratroopers delivered exactly what Eisenhower needed. They held for 6 days until Patton's armor broke through. The German failure at Bastogne marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. The offensive in the Ardennes was supposed to split Allied forces, capture Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to negotiate peace. Hitler had committed his last strategic reserves to the operation. When it failed, Germany had no more offensive capability. From January 1945 onward, the German army could only defend and retreat, all because 18,000 American paratroopers refused to surrender. Today, Bastogne is a quiet town in Belgium. The population is around 15,000. The town square features a monument to the defenders of 1944. Every December, ceremonies remember the siege. Veterans visit when they can. Most are gone now. The last survivors are in their late 90s or have passed away. The foxholes in the fields around Bastogne have been filled in. The destroyed tanks have been removed or placed in museums. The landscape looks peaceful, as if nothing violent ever happened there. But the ground still occasionally yields artifacts, bullets, shell fragments, pieces of equipment. Farmers find them when plowing fields. The story of Bastogne is taught in military academies worldwide. It is a textbook example of how elite troops with inferior numbers and equipment can defeat larger forces through superior morale and tactical skill. Officers study McAuliffe's defense. They analyze how the Americans used terrain, managed ammunition, and maintained unit cohesion under siege conditions. But the most important lesson is psychological. The Germans at Bastogne had numerical superiority, better equipment, and strategic position. They should have won. They lost because they were fighting an enemy that refused to accept defeat. An enemy that believed surrender was impossible and victory was certain. That belief made the 101st Airborne unstoppable. Confidence changes everything in combat. It changes how soldiers fight, how they respond to danger, how they endure hardship. The paratroopers at Bastogne were cold, hungry, and surrounded. But they were confident, and that confidence terrified the Germans more than any weapon the Americans possessed. That is why German soldiers feared the 101st Airborne. Not because of their equipment or training, though both were excellent. They feared the paratroopers because those men could not be broken, could not be intimidated, could not be defeated by any means short of total annihilation. And the Germans discovered they did not have the strength to annihilate them. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania. From veterans to history enthusiasts, you are part of something special here. Thank you for watching and thank you for keeping these stories alive.